Nobody warned London the night everything changed. No thunder announced it. No bell rang. The city just kept moving, vendors pushing carts through cobblestone streets, gas lamps burning orange against the fog, carriages rattling past iron gates. London had no idea that on a cold Tuesday evening in October, in the most forgotten corner of the city, a decision was being made that would shake every drawing room, every royal chamber, and every whispered conversation in the capital for months to come. A carriage stopped outside St. Martha's Orphanage. Not just any carriage. This one was black as midnight, trimmed in gold, and pulled by 4 horses so well groomed they looked carved from shadow. The crest on the door was one London's poorest knew to fear, and London's richest knew to respect: a wolf's head above crossed keys, the Blackwood crest, the mark of the man they called the Iron Duke, Stanley Blackwood, Duke of Ashford, the wealthiest man in England, the most feared, the most alone. He stepped out without a word, coat pressed, jaw set, eyes scanning the crumbling building the way a general surveys a battlefield. Behind him, his secretary fumbled with papers. His guard stood back, hand near his coat. The matron who answered the door nearly fainted. He did not apologize for coming unannounced. He did not smile. He simply said 4 words that would change one young woman's life forever. "I am here to marry." And the girl he chose, the one nobody ever looked at twice, was 19-year-old Helen Carter, an orphan seamstress, a girl with patches on her dress, ink on her fingers, and a quiet kind of dignity that the world had spent years trying to crush. She had no dowry, no family name, no status. She had nothing, which, it turned out, was exactly what made her dangerous. This is the story of a girl who walked into a palace she didn't belong in, married a man she didn't know, and ended up being the only thing standing between him and total destruction. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Helen Carter woke before everyone else, which was not unusual. At St. Martha's Orphanage, the day began at 5 in the morning, but Helen was already awake by 4, sitting near the single window of the sewing room, her needle moving in and out of rough cloth by the weak light of a candle stub. She did not do this because she was told to. She did it because it was the only hour the orphanage belonged to her. Outside, London breathed its grey October breath. Carts rattled in the distance. Somewhere a dog barked, then went quiet. Inside, the building smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wood. 22 girls slept in the room above. Helen had not been one of them for 3 years. She'd volunteered to sleep in the sewing room the night a younger girl cried herself sick over a nightmare and somehow never moved back. That was Helen. She gave things away without thinking and then stood in the gap herself. She was not beautiful in the way London drew beauty. No golden ringlets, no porcelain cheek, no proud carriage. She had brown hair that curled when damp and went straight when dry. Her eyes were dark, steady, and careful, the kind of eyes that watched and weighed and said very little. Her hands were calloused from years of needlework. Her posture had the particular straightness of someone who had learned never to make themselves small, even when every room they walked into tried to make them feel invisible. She was 19. She had been at St. Martha's since she was 3 months old. She did not know who her parents were. The matron, a stout woman named Mrs. Breck, had told her once with the particular cruelty of people who think honesty is kindness, that her mother had left her on the step with nothing but a wool blanket and a small envelope containing a single gold coin, no name, no note, just the coin. Helen kept that coin in a cloth pouch around her neck. She did not know why. She only knew she was not ready to spend it. By afternoon, she had finished 2 shirts, hemmed a skirt, and repaired a coat brought in by a nearby tailor. Mrs. Breck took the payment without acknowledgement. Helen washed her hands and went to help the younger girls with their letters because someone had to, and she was the one who knew how. The evening meal was thin soup and bread. Helen sat at the end of the table, listening to the other girls talk. Mary was 15 and funny. Little Ruth was 7 and afraid of moths. Agnes, who was 17, had been offered a position as a housemaid and could not stop talking about it. "You should come with me," Agnes said to Helen. "I can put in a word." "They will not take me," Helen answered quietly. "I am too old, and I already said no last spring." "Why did you say no?" Helen looked at her soup. The truth was, she had said no because she was afraid of something she could not name, afraid that leaving St. Martha's meant admitting she had nowhere else to go, that the word home had never actually applied to her. "I was not ready," she said. Agnes patted her arm and went back to talking about her new position. Helen ate her soup and told herself tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow was not different, but the day after tomorrow was. The carriage arrived on a Thursday. Helen was in the courtyard, hanging shirts to dry in the thin afternoon sun, when she heard the gate open and every sound in the yard stop at once. The children's chatter, the creak of the well rope, even the pigeons seemed to go quiet. She turned. The man who walked through the gate was tall and dark-coated. He moved the way powerful things move, not fast, not slow, but with a certainty that made the ground seem to organize itself beneath his feet. He had sharp features and dark hair silvering at the temples. His expression was closed, deliberate, impossible to read. He looked at the yard. He looked at the children who had frozen mid-step. He looked at Mrs. Breck, who had gone the color of old flour, and then his eyes found Helen. She did not drop her eyes. She didn't know why. Some instinct told her that this man could smell fear the way a hunting dog smells a trail, and that the worst thing she could do was show him any. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he walked past her toward Mrs. Breck. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Breck called for her. The sitting room smelled of pipe smoke and old carpet. The Duke stood at the window with his back to her. His secretary, a thin young man named Collins, held a folder of papers and looked at Helen with an expression she would later recognize as pity. Stanley Blackwood turned around. Up close, he was not as frightening as he was in the yard. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 35, perhaps older. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that looked less like smile lines and more like the marks of a man who had been watching for danger for a very long time. "Your name is Helen Carter," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "You have been here since infancy." "Yes." "Can you read and write?" "I can, and do arithmetic, and speak passable French." Something flickered across his face, not quite a surprise, more like confirmation. "I am going to make you an offer," he said. "You may refuse it, but I would ask that you hear it first." Helen stood very still. "I require a wife, not for companionship, not for love, for reasons that are legal and political, and which I will not explain in full until you agree. The arrangement will protect you. You will have a home, security, and legal standing as Duchess of Ashford. In return, I ask only for your presence and your discretion." Helen heard Mrs. Breck pull in a sharp breath beside her. She heard Collins shuffle his papers. She heard her own heart very loud in her own ears. She looked at the man in front of her, at the tiredness behind his authority, at the weight behind his stillness, and she asked the only question that felt honest. "Why me?" Stanley Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something she would think about for weeks. "Because you looked at me when everyone else looked away." Helen said yes, not because of the security, though that mattered, not because of the title, though she didn't know yet what it meant. She said yes because something in his voice when he said those words sounded less like a powerful man making a business decision and more like someone who had been alone for a very long time. She said yes because she understood what that felt like. The wedding took place 4 days later. There was no ceremony to speak of, just a brief, formal exchange before a judge in a wood-paneled room that smelled of leather and old law. Collins witnessed it. A woman named Mrs. Holt, who turned out to be the head of the Blackwood household staff, stood to one side with the expression of someone watching a storm come in. Helen wore a dress she had made herself dove-gray, simple, well-fitted. She had no flowers, she had no family. She stood straight and signed the papers in a clean, careful hand, and when the judge congratulated them, Stanley gave a single nod and said nothing. On the carriage ride to Blackwood House, they did not speak. Helen looked out the window at London, passing by the wide streets of Mayfair, the white columns and black iron railings, the doormen outside tall townhouses, watching the carriage go by with recognition and then visible shock. She heard a woman on the pavement say something to her companion and raise her hand to her mouth. She told herself it did not matter. Blackwood House was enormous. 4 stories of pale stone with a garden at the back that ran the full width of the property. The entrance hall had a marble floor and a ceiling so high Helen had to tilt her head back to see it. Portraits of stern-faced men and women in elaborate clothing lined the staircase walls. Every one of them looked like they had opinions about who belonged in their house. Mrs. Holt showed her to her room. They were beautiful and entirely strange. A sitting room with tall windows, a bedroom with a canopied bed, a dressing room larger than the entire sewing room at St. Martha's. Someone had stocked the wardrobe with dresses in fabrics Helen had only ever touched when she was altering them for someone else. "The Duke will expect you at dinner at 8, Mrs. Holt said. "He keeps specific hours. He does not like to be interrupted in his study. He does not accept callers before 11 in the morning. He does not discuss business at the table." "What does he discuss at the table?" Helen asked. Mrs. Holt paused, as though the question had not occurred to her before. "I believe last Thursday he discussed the drainage systems in Edinburgh," she said carefully. Helen nodded. Mrs. Holt left. Helen stood in the middle of the dressing room and put her hand around the coin at her throat. She breathed in, breathed out, and told herself she had faced worse than a large, strange house. She was not entirely sure that was true. Dinner that night was a lesson in what Stanley Blackwood considered normal. He sat at the head of the table in a dark jacket and said almost nothing for the first course. Helen ate her soup and watched him the way she had learned to watch unfamiliar situations quietly, without staring, gathering information. Halfway through the second course, he looked up. "Do you have any questions about the household?" "Several," she said, "but most of them can wait." "Ask one." She considered it. "The man at the gate this morning was not one of your regular staff, was he?" "He watched the street the entire time I arrived, and he did not look at me once." "Normal staff look at new faces." Stanley put down his fork. He looked at her for a long moment with that same expression she had seen in the orphanage sitting room, not quite surprised, something more like assessment. "He is a guard," Stanley said. "There are 6 of them positioned around the property at all times. Are you afraid of something?" "I am cautious," he said. "There is a difference." Helen picked up her own fork. "Of course," she said. "I only ask because if there is danger, I would rather know about it than discover it accidentally." He was quiet again. The footman refilled the water glasses. A log shifted in the fireplace. "I will tell you what you need to know when you need to know it," he said. Helen nodded and turned her attention back to her plate. She filed that sentence away carefully. It was the answer of a man who kept secrets not because he didn't trust her, but because he was used to protecting people by keeping them in the dark. She had met that kind of person before. It never ended as safely as they intended. The days that followed were strange and educational in equal measure. London's aristocracy did not take the marriage quietly. Within a week, 3 calling cards arrived from women whose names Helen did not know, each with handwritten notes that were polite on the surface and pointed underneath. A newspaper column referred to her as the Duke's peculiar selection. A dinner party at the home of Lord Whitmore, which Helen attended in a blue silk dress she'd altered to fit in one afternoon, went silent when she entered and then roared back to life with whispers. 2 women approached her near the dessert table. One was named Martha, the other Taylor. They were both young, both beautifully dressed, and both wearing smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "You are settling in well, I hope," Martha said, surveying Helen's dress. "It must be quite the adjustment. Where exactly did you say you came from?" "I did not say," Helen replied pleasantly. "The soup is excellent, don't you think?" Taylor laughed, a light, deliberate laugh that said she had not found anything funny. We were simply curious, she said. Stanley has never shown any interest in, she paused, searching unconventional matches. Then I suppose I am the exception, Helen said, and moved away before either of them could answer. Later that night, in the carriage home, she stared at her hands and allowed herself 3 seconds of genuine distress. Then she put it away. Stanley, beside her, had not spoken since they left. He was looking out the window. In the gas lamp light, he looked carved from something harder than stone. Then, without turning, he said, "You handled that well." Helen looked at him. "You were watching?" "I watch everything," he said. "It is how I have stayed alive." She thought about asking what that meant. She decided, instead, to wait. Some answers, she was learning, came only when you stopped chasing them. Kevin Marsh arrived at Blackwood House on a Wednesday morning, looking, as he always did, as though he had been arguing with someone and had narrowly won. He was Stanley's oldest friend, or the closest thing to a friend that a man like Stanley allowed himself. Kevin was a scholar and a quiet investigator, the kind of man who could find information other people didn't know existed and present it so calmly that you didn't realize until later how extraordinary it was. He had a warm face and an untidy way of carrying himself, and he looked at Helen when they were introduced with an expression of open, uncomplicated curiosity that was almost startling after a week of calculated stares. "So you're the one," he said, shaking her hand. "I beg your pardon." He glanced at Stanley, who was watching from the doorway of the study with his arms crossed. "He will explain eventually," Kevin said. Then, to Stanley, "May I have the room?" Stanley looked at Helen as though measuring something, then gave a short nod and walked away. Kevin sat down across from her in the sitting room and folded his hands on his knee. "I want you to know that what Stanley did was not careless," he said. "He is not a careless man. He chose you deliberately. I thought you deserved to know that. Why are you telling me now? Because you look like someone who is waiting for the floor to fall out. And you should not be waiting for that. You should be watching the walls." Helen stared at him. "The walls," she repeated. "There is someone who has been working against Stanley for a long time," Kevin said, his voice dropping. "Someone close to him. We don't know who yet, but they have been pulling strings in Parliament, in the courts, in his business dealings. Small things, each one easy to dismiss. Together, they point somewhere dangerous." Helen set down her teacup. "And you are telling me this because you pay attention," he said simply. "Stanley told me what you noticed about the gate guard on your first day. Most people who've lived in houses like this their whole lives don't see what you saw in 5 minutes." She looked toward the study door, which was closed. "He does not know you're telling me this," she said. "No, and I would not recommend mentioning it." Kevin left an hour later. Helen spent the rest of the afternoon in the library not reading but thinking. The library was a tall, warm room lined floor to ceiling with books and smelling of beeswax and old paper. It was the best room in the house, in her opinion, the only room that felt like someone had been comfortable in it. She was still there when Stanley came in that evening. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her, as though he had expected the room to be empty. Then he came in anyway, chose a chair near the window, and opened a document he carried from the study. They sat in the same room for almost 2 hours and did not speak. It was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of two people who are tired of pretending they are not both thinking. Finally, Helen asked, "Do you sleep?" Stanley looked up. "Occasionally," he said. "Do you eat meals that are not designed for performance?" A very faint line appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the beginning of the idea of one. "I ate bread over the sink this morning at 6 a.m., he said. "Does that satisfy your concern?" "It answers my question," she said. "Satisfying is a different standard." He looked back at his document, but the line at his mouth didn't go away. Over the next 2 weeks, the library became the place where the real marriage happened. Not the one on paper, not the one London gossiped about, but the slow, quiet one where two people who had both spent their lives alone began, without planning to be less alone. He told her, a little at a time, About his empire, the shipping interests, and the coal holdings and the parliamentary seat he'd inherited at 22 when his father died, and he had stepped into a role he hadn't been ready for, and had spent the next 13 years making himself ready by sheer force. She told him, a little at a time, about St. Martha's, about the sewing room, and the gold coin, and the way she had made herself useful, because being useful was the only way she could think of to earn the right to stay. "You don't have to earn the right to stay anywhere," he said one evening. It was not said gently, it came out blunt, almost irritated-y, the way he said most things. "You exist. That is sufficient." Helen looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "Nobody has ever said that to me before." He looked away. His jaw worked slightly. Then he stood, said good night, and left. Helen sat in the library for a long time afterward, her hand around the gold coin, wondering how a man could be so deliberately armored and so quietly hungry at the same time, wondering what, exactly, he was protecting himself from. She was beginning to understand that the danger Kevin had warned her about was not the only kind this household contained. There was also the danger of learning to care about someone who lived behind walls, and the particular danger of realizing, quietly and without fanfare, that you already did. The night the carriage stopped, the attack came on a Tuesday evening in November, in the 15 minutes between Mayfair and home. They had attended a reception at the home of Lord Calloway, a political gathering, full of men in good coats, saying careful things about Parliament and taxation, while their wives talked about horses and country houses. Stanley had been quiet the whole evening in the particular way that meant he was paying close attention to everything, and Helen had spent the reception doing what she had become quietly good at, listening to the right conversations at the right moments and storing information like a library stores books. She had, in the past 3 weeks, collected several things worth knowing. That Lord Calloway's man of business had been seen twice at a law office linked to Stanley's largest competitor. That a parliamentary vote on shipping tariffs had been delayed twice in the past month, both times after Stanley's supporters reported last-minute pressure to change their votes. That someone had searched Stanley's correspondence at the club, not the whole correspondence, just one letter, carefully replaced, the seal repressed slightly off-center. She had not told Stanley any of this yet. She was waiting until she had something complete enough to matter. They were 5 minutes from home when the first horse screamed. The carriage lurched hard, sideways, the kind of jolt that slides you across the seat, whether you mean to move or not. Helen grabbed the strap above the door. Outside she heard the driver shouting, then a sound that was not a carriage sounded something heavy, moving fast. Stanley's hand closed around her arm in the same instant the carriage stopped. "Get down," he said. Quiet, absolute. She dropped to the floor of the carriage without arguing. He was already at the door, and then outside it, and she heard voices raised, terse, the sounds of men who had stopped pretending they were something other than what they were. 3 minutes. That was how long it lasted. It felt longer. When Stanley opened the carriage door again, his knuckles were bleeding, and his expression had the particular quality of a man who has confirmed something he already knew. "Are you hurt?" he asked, looking at her very directly. "No," she said. "Are you?" "No." He climbed back in. 2 of his men rode ahead. 1 stayed close behind. The driver took a different route home, longer, through streets they knew. Helen sat across from him and waited until the worst of the adrenaline had passed before she spoke. "There have been 3 previous incidents," she said. "The letter at the club, the pressure on your parliamentary supporters, the meetings at Calloway's business manager's law office. I have been collecting these things, and I apologize for not telling you sooner. I wanted to have more before I—" "How?" Stanley said. "Did you know about the letter? The steward who replaces the correspondence tray always does it from the right. Whoever opened that letter was left-handed and had shorter fingers. None of your regular staff match that." He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, not the closed-off authority, not the careful distance. something that was trying very hard to remain controlled and not quite managing. "Helen," he said. "Yes, I owe you an explanation." "You owe me several," she said, "but we can begin with one." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, London slid past the window, gas lamps and railings and the dark shapes of trees. "I knew your parents," he said. The carriage went on. Helen did not speak. "Your father was Lord Edmund Ashford, my father's younger brother, my uncle. He married without the family's blessing, a woman named Cecilia, and they had one child. When you were 3 months old, someone tried to have them killed. Edmund sent Cecilia away with you and stayed behind. He did not survive the week." Helen's hand found the coin at her throat. "The coin," Stanley said, looking at it. "Edmund gave it to Cecilia the night he sent her away. It was the only thing she had time to take." The carriage stopped at the gate of Blackwood House. Neither of them moved. "You have been looking for me since then," Helen said. It was not a question. "For 15 years, he said. "I found you 8 months ago. The marriage was not a convenience. It was the only legal protection I could give you immediately, without announcing publicly that you existed and giving whoever killed your father the chance to finish what they started." Helen sat with this for a long moment. 15 years. The cold orphanage, the patched dresses, the waiting, all of it had happened while this man had been quietly, steadily looking for her. She thought about being angry. She had every right. She thought about what it meant that he had found her, and then stood in that sitting room and let her say yes or no. That he had not simply taken her, or commanded, or deceived, but offered a choice, even though the choice was tangled up in things she didn't yet understand. "Who killed my father?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I am becoming certain it is someone I still see regularly." He looked out the window, jaw tight. The weight in that sentence was enormous. Helen followed his gaze. "Then we find them," she said, quietly, steadily. The way she said everything, he looked at her, that almost smile again, but different this time. Warmer, something it hadn't been before. "We," he said. "You did not marry a decoration," she told him. "You told me that yourself." He hadn't, but he didn't correct her. He only nodded once and got out of the carriage. Helen followed him inside, heart beating hard, gold coin warm in her fist, and understood that everything had just changed. The weeks that followed had a different quality, tense and quiet and close, the way air feels before a storm that hasn't broken yet. Kevin came every other day. He brought documents and names and observations, spreading them across the library table while Helen organized them, and Stanley stood at the window doing his thinking where she could watch him do it. They worked in a triangle with Kevin's knowledge, Stanley's resources, and Helen's particular gift for seeing patterns where others saw noise. And patterns there were. Someone was systematically dismantling Stanley's influence, not loudly, not through confrontation or scandal, but quietly, from the inside. A business partner was offered terms that made staying with Stanley less attractive. A political ally received false but convincing information that put him at legal risk if he continued to vote with Stanley's coalition. A supply contract, years in the making, dissolved overnight for reasons nobody could fully explain. Small moves, all of them are plausibly coincidental, all of them pointing in the same direction. Helen was the one who drew the line. She had spent 3 nights going through everything, not the financial records or the political documents, but the calendar. Every incident mapped against Stanley's schedule. Every disruption measured against who had access to advanced knowledge of his plans. Only 3 people could have known every date involved. She brought it to Stanley at 7 in the morning, while he was still in his study with his first cup of coffee. She put the paper on the desk in front of him and said nothing. He read it. He read it a second time. Then he put down his cup and said very quietly, "Smith, Richard Smith, his advisor of 11 years. The man who had sat beside him in parliamentary chambers, who had managed his correspondence during his father's death, who had attended every dinner and meeting and negotiation that mattered in Stanley's adult life. The man who had been at every event where the incidents occurred, whose access to the diary was total, whose knowledge of Stanley's affairs was deeper than anyone's. "I need more than a calendar," Stanley said, not looking up. "Kevin found the law office connection," Helen said. "Smith's brother-in-law is a partner. The firm processes the transfer documents for every business that has recently pulled away from you. The money goes somewhere beyond the law office, but Kevin is following it." Stanley stood. He walked to the window. He stood there for a long time, and Helen watched him carry the weight of understanding that the person he had trusted most in his professional life had been working against him probably for years. Probably since before Stanley even knew he had enemies. "I want to be wrong," he said. "I know," she said. "I have known Richard for 11 years. I know that too." He turned around. The authority was still there, but underneath it was something raw and tired, the expression of a man who has built his life on discipline and control, and is being told that neither one protected him from the thing he should have seen. "What does he want?" Stanley asked. "If it's money, he has more than enough." "It's the seat," Helen said. "The parliamentary seat. If you are discredited, if your coalition falls apart, and you are removed, there is a by-election. Kevin says Smith has been building his own coalition for 2 years. He wants what you have." Stanley's expression changed, settled, went very still in the way that meant he had moved past the hurt and into something more dangerous. "He cannot simply have what I have," he said. "No, so he is going to destroy it and rebuild it in his own name." She let that sit. "Then he will move soon. Whatever he is planning, the endgame will be public. Something that cannot be undone quietly. Something with witnesses." "The Crown Ball," Stanley said. "Lord Whitmore is hosting a royal reception in 3 weeks. Every person of consequence in London will be there, including the members of my coalition." Helen nodded slowly. "Then that is where he will do it." Stanley looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the room, and Helen had just enough time to register that he was closer than he had ever been, before he raised his hand and put it against her face gently, just for a moment. "You should not have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "I am doing it anyway." He dropped his hand, stepped back, became the Duke of Ashford again. But something had been said that could not be unsaid. Something had passed between them that neither of them named yet, but both of them knew was there. Helen walked back to the library. She sat down, pressed her hands flat on the table, and breathed steadily until the feeling stopped overwhelming her. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Because there was still much to do, and she had not come this far by falling apart at the moments that mattered. The Crown Ball at Lord Whitmore's was the kind of event London held to remind itself what it was. 300 guests, 40 servants, 2 members of the royal household in attendance. Music from an orchestra that had played for the Queen herself. Candles by the thousand reflected in mirrors and crystal, and the carefully polished ambitions of everyone present. Helen wore deep emerald silk. Mrs. Holt had brought the dress 2 days prior, along with a jewel case that contained, among other things, an emerald pendant that had belonged to Stanley's mother. Helen had looked at the necklace for a long time without touching it, and then Mrs. Holt had said, in a softer voice than she usually used, "He asked for this one specifically." Helen had put it on. Now she stood at the top of the entrance staircase with her hand on Stanley's arm, and she felt with the particular clarity that arrives in important moments what it meant to have a name. Not the name she'd been given at St. Martha's. The name she was beginning to understand she had always had. The name that had been hidden and hunted and was now standing in a ballroom full of London's most powerful people in a dress that fit perfectly and a necklace that caught the light. Martha and Taylor were there. They looked at Helen with expressions that had shifted from disdain to something more uncertain. Smith was there. Helen found him within the first 5 minutes, a tall, elegantly built man in his 40s, with a face designed to look trustworthy and eyes that didn't fully commit to it. He was talking to Lord Calloway near the fireplace, laughing at something, comfortable in the way of a man who believed he had already won. He had not seen her looking. An hour into the reception it happened. A royal attendant approached Lord Whitmore, who was hosting for the Crown. A document was produced. Whitmore went very still. Then he turned, and the room, following the habit of powerful people sensing a shift in power, went quiet. The attendant announced that evidence had been presented to the Crown's office suggesting that the Duke of Ashford had been engaged in correspondence with foreign interests aimed at influencing parliamentary decisions to the detriment of the Crown. The word treason was not said aloud. It didn't have to be. The silence in the ballroom was the kind that has teeth. 2 guards moved towards Stanley. Helen felt his arm go rigid under her hand. She released his arm and stepped forward. She heard Martha say something. She heard Taylor's sharp intake of breath. She was aware, in the peripheral way of someone very focused, of 300 pairs of eyes turning to track her as she walked to the center of the room and positioned herself between the guards and her husband. The royal attendant looked at her. "Your Grace," he said with cautious formality. "I have documents," Helen said. Her voice carried. She had not raised it. "Documents pertaining to the evidence that has been presented tonight. I would ask that the Crown's representative receive them before any action is taken." Silence. "I have here," she continued, drawing the folded papers Kevin had prepared from the small bag at her wrist, "a record of the financial transfers executed through a law firm with known connections to Mr. Richard Smith, who is currently standing near the east fireplace. These transfers correspond precisely to the disruption of the Duke's business and political networks over the past 18 months. I also have here sworn testimony from 2 members of Mr. Smith's own household staff confirming that Mr. Smith commissioned the false correspondence that has been presented as evidence tonight." The room had gone so still, it felt like the air had stopped moving. Helen turned to look at Smith. He was smiling. A controlled, social smile is the smile of a man deciding how to handle an inconvenience. "The Duchess is understandably upset," Smith said, addressing the room with easy authority. "This is a serious situation, and I imagine the law office is Hartwell and Gray," Helen said calmly. "Your brother-in-law, Thomas Gray, is a founding partner. The financial records going back 22 months show systematic payments to intermediaries connected to the disruption of the Duke's parliamentary coalition. The foreign correspondence that was presented as evidence tonight was drafted at Hartwell and Gray's offices. The handwriting on the commission letter matches your own, Mr. Smith, in 7 distinct characteristics. I have had this verified by 2 independent experts." She extended the papers to the royal attendant. "I am asking the Crown to examine this evidence before it does anything irreversible," she said. "That is all." Lord Whitmore took the papers himself. He read in silence for a long, heavy moment. Across the room, Helen watched Smith's smile begin to fail. It failed slowly, the way a structure fails when the weight becomes too much, not all at once, but piece by piece, the careful architecture of it giving way. 2 Crown guards moved, not toward Stanley. Towards Smith, the room erupted not in panic, but in the controlled, furious sound of 300 people all needing to speak at once. Lord Whitmore called for order. The orchestra, which had not known when to stop playing, finally went silent. In the middle of it, Stanley was beside her. She hadn't heard him move. He was simply there, as he tended to be when it mattered. "Helen," he said very quietly, just for her. "I know," she said, later, because there was still much to manage, and they both knew it. This was not the moment, but she felt his hand find hers in the crowd, and she held it, and for now that was enough. What followed the ball took 3 weeks to fully resolve. Smith was taken for questioning that same night. Kevin's documentation, combined with the testimony Helen had arranged through 2 of Smith's former household staff people who had been poorly treated and had very little reason for loyalty, proved sufficient for the Crown's inquiry to proceed. The financial trail was deep and detailed. Smith had been meticulous, which ironically made him easier to prosecute. Every transfer had a record. Every commission had a receipt. Every move toward Stanley's destruction was documented in the orderly fashion of a man who had never seriously imagined being caught. the parliamentary coalition held. Stanley's seat was never formally in danger once the fabricated evidence was set aside, and the members of his alliance who had been pressured quietly realigned. Two of them came personally to Blackwood House to make their position clear, and they looked at Helen with the specific interest of men who are recalibrating a situation. Lord Whitmore arranged a formal review of Helen's documents. Kevin testified, the two independent experts testified, a judge reviewed the handwriting analysis, Smith was charged. And then came the other thing. Kevin had, in the course of his investigation into the financial trail, followed one thread that led away from Smith and back further, much further, into the records of a legal trust established 22 years ago by a family called Ashford, the name of Stanley's mother's line, as distinct from Blackwood. The trust existed for one beneficiary, Helen Carter, born to Edmund and Cecilia Ashford, née Vane. The name meant something in London. It meant a great deal. The Vane family was one of the old houses not wealthy in the modern sense, but ancient in the way that certain families were ancient, connected to land and titles that went back far enough to matter under laws that still governed certain types of estate inheritance. Helen was not just Stanley's orphaned cousin by marriage. She was Lady Helen Vane Ashford, legitimate heir to the Vane estate. A woman with a name, a bloodline, a legal identity that had been hidden for her protection and was now fully and formally established. Mrs. Holt cried when Kevin announced it. She covered her mouth and turned away, and then, when she turned back, her expression had resolved into the particular warmth of a woman who has been trying not to be fond of someone, and has finally given up. Helen received the news in the library. She sat very still for a long time, her hand around the gold coin. Then she let it go, and held it in her open palm, and looked at it properly for the first time in years. It was inscribed on the back. She had never looked closely enough to see it. HVA. Her father's initials for her name. The name he had chosen, the name her mother had carried out of the house on the night everything burned. Stanley found her there. He came in, as he always did, without announcement, with a directness that had stopped feeling intrusive and had started feeling like the particular comfort of someone whose presence you trust. He sat in the chair across from her. He did not ask how she was feeling. He had learned that she would tell him what she needed him to know. She looked at him. "You knew about the trust," she said. "I suspected it existed. I had not been able to find it. But you knew what I was, what my name was." "Yes," she nodded slowly. "Then why," she said, "did you let me keep introducing myself as Helen Carter?" He was quiet for a moment. In the firelight he looked less like the Iron Duke and more like a man who has something he needs to say and is deciding how to say it honestly. "Because Helen Carter is who you are," he said. "The name on the document is a legal fact, but you made yourself. The girl in the sewing room at 4 in the morning. The girl who looked at me when no one else did. The woman who stood in a ballroom full of London's most powerful people and spoke the truth without flinching. That is you. That did not come from a bloodline." Helen looked at him for a long time. "I am very angry with you about several things," she said. "I know. You should have told me sooner. Yes, I will accept your apology at some point in the next several days. I will offer it whenever you would like it." She put the coin back into its pouch. She stood. She walked across the room and stood in front of him, closer than she usually stood, and looked at him very directly. "I am also not angry about other things," she said. Something shifted in his face. The armor came down, not all at once, but enough. "Helen," he said. "Yes, I have been alone for a very long time. I know that. I am not sure I know how to, neither am I," she said. "But I think the point is that we do it anyway." He was quiet. Then he reached out slowly and took her hand. Not the urgent grip of the carriage or the ballroom. Something simpler. Something that said, "Here. Here is where I am. Here is where I intend to stay." She let him hold it. And for a man who had spent 13 years making himself unreachable, and a woman who had spent 19 years being unseen, it was quietly, privately, in a room full of books and firelight, the beginning of something real. London talked about them for months. The women who had smiled at Helen over dessert tables revised their opinions with remarkable speed. The newspapers, which had called her the Duke's peculiar selection, rewrote the story as romance and discovery. Society, which had tried to make her feel small at every turn, now positioned itself as having recognized her quality from the beginning. Helen was not particularly interested in any of that. She was interested in the morning when she woke to find a book on her pillow, the specific collection of French poetry she had mentioned once, weeks ago in passing with no note. She was interested in the evening. Stanley came to the library, and, instead of sitting in his own chair, sat beside her on the settee and asked her what she was reading. She was interested in the quiet shape of a life that was, at last, genuinely hers. She was interested in learning what it felt like when someone chose you, not because you were useful, not because you were convenient, but because of the particular, irreplaceable truth of who you were. She discovered it felt like belonging. She had waited 19 years for it. She did not intend to waste a moment. The gold coin went into a small glass case on the library mantelpiece. Helen put it there on the morning she received the formal legal confirmation of her name and title. She looked at it there, the simple disc of gold that had been the only thing standing between her and absolute anonymity for 19 years, and she thought about her father, a man she would never know, and her mother, whose face she would never see, and the strange, long, difficult path that had brought her from a step in October to a library in December, with a name and a home, and a man who had, in his careful, armored way, been moving toward her for 15 years. She thought about what it costs to be hidden, and what it costs to be found. She thought about the younger girls at St. Martha's, Mary and Ruth and Agnes, who was now in her house position and sent letters every few weeks, and she arranged quietly a donation sufficient to rebuild the orphanage's sewing room and add a schoolroom, because the thing about finally having power is that it is most meaningful when you use it to give someone else the thing you needed most. She thought about Smith, who had wanted what someone else had, and had destroyed himself trying to take it, and she thought, the things worth having are not the things that can be taken. They are the things built so slowly and quietly that nobody sees them forming until they are already there. She thought about Stanley. She thought about Stanley a great deal. He was, by any measure, still difficult. He was still early to his study and late to his bed. He still kept things back longer than he should before he said them. He still stood at the windows too long, but he had stopped keeping things from her. And on the nights when the house was quiet and the fire burned low in the library grate, he would close whatever document he was working on and turn to her, and they would talk, really talk, the way, too, people talk when they have stopped performing for each other, about the world and books and the things they were afraid of and the things they hoped for. Those were the best hours of her life. She had not known, 19 years ago on a doorstep in October, wrapped in wool with a gold coin tucked beside her, what the future contained. She was glad she had stayed long enough to find out. This story carries with it the quiet truth that who you are is never determined by where you begin. Helen began with nothing, no name, no family, no certainty, and became the most powerful woman in a room full of people who had been powerful their entire lives. She did not do it by becoming someone else. She did it by refusing, in every room and every silence, to become less than herself. Stanley's truth is this: that power held alone is only armor. It is only when the armor comes down, when you allow one person to stand beside you in the fire, that power becomes something worth having. And the moral that lives beneath all of this, for anyone who has ever felt unseen or overlooked or hidden away, you are not invisible. You are simply not yet in the room where you belong. Give yourself time. Move toward what is honest. Trust the people who show you, through their actions, that they have been looking for you. You are worth finding. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Thank you for being here.